For as long as card games have existed, draft has been a very common thing to be seen in them. It is a interesting way to test one's skills by taking cards that are randomly given to you, assembling them into a deck, and then utilizing them the best you can to beat others that have done the same. Within cards, this format has been around for many years, and it has always been a format that offers great rewards. Draft is one of the best ways to translate your gold into packs and more gold. And it is something that I also see a lot of people struggle with, as the demands of draft can be similar to that of ladder, but also so different that it is hard to shift one's mentality. Today's video is going to be a guide where I talk about how I personally draft different decks, what I'm looking for in cards, and to give you a general idea of how to think while drafting and how to what to focus on in the matches. Before we get into those tips, it's important to keep scope of what draft is asking of people in order to be a profitable mode. It is important to note that for 150 gold, you only need to make 150 gold worth of profits in order to actually come out ahead. This means that in general, 3 wins is enough to break even in the draft format. So that means that with 3 losses to a draft format, we only need to win 3 out of 3 times in a total of 6 games, or a 50% win rate. If we can get 3 wins before we drop out, we have pretty much broken even, as the one bonus is generally worth about 10 gold, which means that the pack we pay for is 100 gold and we get 40 gold back. Of course, if we can get to 4 wins, which requires a slightly higher win rate, we actually get a guaranteed payout of 10 gold positive plus whatever the bonus gets us. And if we can reach all the way to 6 wins, we actually get a full refund on our draft entrance on top of a free pack and a bonus, with 7 wins being a full-on 30 extra gold, 2 bonuses, 1 pack, and all the other goodies. So we really only need to focus on just getting a couple wins out of even bad decks in order to make draft a worthwhile way to play and grow your collection. To start out with, let's talk about the bread and butter of any draft deck, which are units. Units are going to be the foundational thing of every draft deck to pretty much ever exist. You are unable to really build a deck that is super control or combo oriented in draft due to the random nature of things. And in fact, most draft decks are generally going to fall into what is commonly referred to as mid-range. Mid-range are decks that look to play efficient units alongside some removal and other orders in order to eventually build a board that the enemy cannot deal with, and then using said board to actually kill them. This is pretty much what every draft deck is looking to build, and as such, a lot of things will be applicable between the different nations because most of them are going to funnel into this board-centric type of deck. When it comes to trying to build a good mid-range deck in draft, I generally break unit types down into 3 main categories. There are value units, tempo units, and snowball units. Value units are the easiest to sum up. These are cards that, in one way or the other, are able to make you have extra cards or resources and force the enemy to deal with them in an inefficient manner. A good example is something like the Focke-Wulf 190. This is a 6-credit 5/5 fighter that on deployment draws a card. This is a very solid example of value because even if the enemy immediately removes it with one of their orders, you drew a card off of it, meaning that the enemy has spent 1 card to deal with your fighter, but you still have an extra card in hand. Value is important in order to ensure that decks do not run out of steam before games go long. It is important as mid-range decks and draft specifically can very often turn into slugging matches of who has enough late game stuff to actually outlast the opponent. So this is where value units are very important. However, I would not say they are the most important type. Instead, I would give that caveat to tempo units. Tempo units are units that, in one way or the other, when they are played on a turn, they immediately do something to impact the enemy board. Common examples of this are something like Blitz, allowing the unit to immediately operate, or it is something like a deployment effect such as the F2 here that is able to retreat a unit on the enemy's side. This is a good example of a tempo unit because not only are you playing your own 5/5 tank to the board, but you are often retreating an enemy unit into their hand, forcing the enemy to replay it. Tempo units are, I would say, on average, the go-to thing that you should be looking for in draft. If you're unsure of what to pick, whatever gives you good tempo is often a very solid option. Because if you can build up enough tempo, you can kind of create that overwhelming board position and just kill people, even if they have a resource advantage. And then the third type of unit, generally I relate it to what is called snowballing. Now, snowballing units are, you can imagine it as essentially these are units that if they are left on board are going to become more and more problematic for the enemy. These are cards that are very good at getting out of control and will win you the match if the enemy cannot respond to it. The Sissy 5D is a good example of this. Although it only starts out as a 2-credit 1/2 guard, if the enemy cannot deal with this quickly and they start playing units or are deploying units or are otherwise getting their units killed, the Sissy will quickly turn into a 2/3, a 3/4, a 4/5, a 5/6, and can become so big that the enemy cannot effectively deal with it. Another common example are things like bombers. Even though bombers such as like the JU-87B2 might not be the most game-ending threat in general, bombers, if they are left on board, will repeatedly get free attacks, dealing damage and killing smaller units, softening up bigger units, or pushing damage to the face. And eventually, if the enemy doesn't deal with it, there will be a breaking point where they become overwhelmed. So you can essentially imagine snowballers as must-kill threats that often are a bit slow when they are initially played, at least slower than something like a tempo unit, but they are giving you a thing where if the enemy can't deal with it, they will end up dying to it. In an ideal world, you are looking to try to get a little bit of all three of these types of units in your deck. A good amount of tempo units that are able to come down and immediately impact the board are great in order to make sure you never fall too far behind. A good amount of value units that trade well or draw you cards or somehow create additional cards and are forcing bad trades from the enemy are also very useful because they are able to ensure that you are going up in card advantage and are able to either respond to enemy threats or you are able to just outlast the enemy. And then it's also good to have a handful of game-ending threats or snowballers that are able to, if unanswered, take over a match, whether these are big monstrous tanks as talked about, or they are smaller bombers that are just continually attacking over and over. A mix of all three of them can give you a very well-rounded deck. And if I had to rank them, I would generally say you want mostly tempo units, then some value units, and a couple snowballing units. Tempo is generally just the best option to go with if you are trying to get a good deck going, as being proactive on the board is the best thing to be doing in draft. Having some value units are crucial, though, in order to keep a game going after the first couple turns. Otherwise, you'll just run out of steam, and if the enemy plays a big guard or some big unit you can't deal with, you just end up losing. And then a couple snowball threats, if you can squeeze them in there, are good, but they're not crucial to a functional draft deck. I think it is also important to point out that even bad cards will generally fall into one of these three categories. So, as an example, something like, say, the JU-87B Stuka. This is a card that is frankly not that good. As a 3/2 bomber that does nothing and needs to attack the enemy HQ, it is slow, inconsistent, and if you're trading with it, then it's not even getting extra value out of itself. However, this is still a unit that can be considered a snowballer, as even if it is just a relatively low statted bomber, if the enemy can't deal with it, it is growing more and more out of control. And if it can go face, it can quickly strip the enemy of resources. So it's a good practice, in my opinion, to understand that even though a card like the Stuka is really bad, it is sometimes worthwhile to consider, do I need something like a snowballing threat, and is this better than taking a really crappy unit like, say, something like the 1st Infantry Regiment, that maybe you already have plenty of 1-drops, and a bad snowballing unit is better than that of another 1-drop that you don't need and isn't really doing anything on its own. However, units are not the only type of card that are going to be found in draft. There are many orders and countermeasures that we also need to talk about. Generally, I would say that orders fall into 3 main types, at least for draft. You have card draw, removal, and board buffers. I would generally say that countermeasures fall into the removal category for this circumstance, but the reason that I clump these into 3 categories is that it is really, really, really important that you find at least a little bit of removal and at least a little bit of card draw for a draft deck. In fact, I would generally say that if you're early in drafting or partway into a draft and you have not found any card draw or any removal, that you need to start valuing that higher than even good units. Because even if you have nothing but fantastic units in your deck, the enemy is going to play stuff that your units might not be able to deal with, or you might not be prepared to. And orders are how you most often are able to stop the enemy from snowballing with their own bombers or big tanks or whatnot. On top of that, orders generally have a lot of important card draw on them, which makes it so that card draw is, able to keep you in the match in a similar way to value units. They are important pieces to the puzzle that cannot be ignored and can often complement your choices of other units. However, at the same time, these orders and these removal pieces and draw pieces, as you start getting them, they interestingly become less and less valuable overall. Essentially, the first card, like Gathering Storm, that you get, this big card draw, the first copy you get is really, really good. It gives you a really good late game refill that'll draw a bunch of units out of your deck and allow you to keep fighting. However, the second copy isn't as valuable, and the third copy is definitely less valuable. Because even though that is more card draw, the fact that you already have one of them to get some card draw in means you need to have a good amount of units to back that up. Again, you can't really build a control deck, at least not without very good draft pools. And as such, you need to make sure that you have a little bit of card draw and removal, but as the draft goes on, once you get those, you should start focusing back towards good units, tempo units, value units, etc. As for the last type of orders that we really need to talk about, which are buffing units, buffs are going to vary, as some of them are better than others and are overall different. But in general, it's not bad to have a couple buffs around, but they're also not fundamental for a deck. You have to kind of weigh them versus having more units or finding other more important orders like removal. But something like Aunt Frida can serve as not only a way to buff your board, but also as a value tool, as being able to have multiple different buffs throughout the game in one card means that this is almost like a value tool that also allows you to apply more pressure. Of course, other buffs might be lower impact, but even something like Combined Arms is fairly solid as long as you have a deck that can reasonably play a number of tanks. There are going to be orders that also don't really fit into the three types we talked about. This is going to be stuff like Scrap Metal or a countermeasure like Lightning Strike. And these cards are generally pretty bad for draft. If a card is like Scrap Metal and requires a lot of specific things to line up, such as having a lot of salvage units in your deck so you can actually salvage stuff, or if it's a card like Lightning Strike that literally has no impact on units or the board or anything like that, you should generally try to avoid them. You want your stuff somehow developing the board, and having a card like Scrap Metal, which could maybe be a 1 credit, choose and discard a unit to draw a card, that's really bad. And you need to just be aware of that even if your cards, are lining up, just be wary of combo cards because they can be very inconsistent, and never take them unless you already have a lot of pieces that are able to support them. At which point they can be really strong, but you should not try to force such things. That's often a way to get a really bad draft deck with really garbage cards in it. Now, due to the nature of how draft works, the mid-range formats that many decks end up in will impact your ideal curve within a draft format. Notably, a deck generally wants to have the majority of its deck range from 3 to 5 credit units, or orders, or whatever, because that is generally about the precipice where your units are big enough to remain impactful later in the game, but are not so expensive that they become impossible to play. Now, it's important not to have a lack of 1 or 2 drops, and it's important to always try to have at least a couple really big units in your deck. You kind of want to imagine this as a mountain, with 4 being the apex of a mountain, and then it gradually decreasing the further away you move from it. Generally, a deck like, for example, this German deck, it is a bit light on 5 and 6 drops, but the additional 7 drops kind of help to balance that out. And the fact that I still have a good amount of 1, 2, and 3 drop units is really important because it means that I'll be able to play the early game consistently. I have a lot of 4 drops, which are usually decent enough to be playing throughout the mid game, and then I have a couple really big cards to play in the late game. If we quickly jump over to another deck like this draft format, you can see kind of a similar thing, with the peak being around the 3, 4, and 5 drop. This deck ended up having a lot of 2 drops and not a lot of 1 drops in it, but it also lacked a lot of, pretty much had no 7 drops and very few 5 and 6 drops. And this does impact how decks play out, which can be its whole own video or discussion topic. But generally, you kind of want to focus and make sure that you have some cards in all 3 periods of the game. So this can impact your draft. If, for example, if I was drafting this deck and I looked at this curve, okay, I have a lot of 2 and 3 and 4 drops, so I would maybe value some weaker 6 or 7 drops just to kind of pad out my late game a bit more, or look for maybe a couple 1 drops so I have something to do on that turn, instead of picking maybe another really good 4 drop. Having a good curve is important for draft and allows you to often play the game a bit better and not fall too far behind. There is one more thing that we really need to talk about within the Cards draft format, because it can offer some pretty significant changes in how one evaluates card choices. And that is the fact that within Cards, you have the ability to be offered stacks of cards. meaning you can potentially have 2 or 3 of the same copies of cards offered alongside singular copies of other cards. So, as an example, I have 3 choices here. A single version of the FI-156 fighter, Run the Battlefield, or the 10.5 centimeter LEFH. Now, of these, none of these are very good options. If I was offered these 3 in a draft, this would overall be a pretty underwhelming choice. However, Run the Battlefield is pretty awful in general, being too hard to line up. And let's say I don't even have anything else in my draft. This is my first pick. Run the Battlefield is too risky and too inconsistent to really be even worth trying. And on top of that, the FI-156 is a really bad fighter. 3 credits for a 1-3 that might not even do anything with countermeasures is not going to be a good effect. But the 10.5 is probably the best unit on an individual basis. However, I am offered 3 of them, meaning that I would have to take 3 of these 10.5s in order to actually take them. And in this instance, I would say it is correct to actually choose the FI-156 and take a single bad card rather than 3 bad cards. Even though the 10.5 is a little less crap than the FI-156, it is the fact that there are multiple bad cards stacked together that make them less appealing. Now, the opposite is also true. Let's say I have an option between something like a 20th Panzer Grenadier, 2 copies of the Focke-Wulf, and something like, say, a Wolfpack. In this instance, there is, I think, arguments for all 3 of these cards to be used. However, something like the Focke-Wulf, by being multiple copies, becomes more appealing. 3 Focke-Wulfs is, like, for example, very hard to pass up. That is a lot of really good late-game value units. And even though 20th Panzer Grenadier might be better tempo while still providing value, you want to take good cards when they are offered to you. So a good card in a stack actually becomes even more appealing. And you may want to pass over technically better cards in order to double up on ensuring good cards. You can never know what is coming next and if you will find something to fill gaps in your deck. So if you are offered something to fill a gap like late game units or early drops, it can be incentivized to grab them while they are there. It helps to ensure consistency in your deck and overall make your decks more consistent and more well-rounded by just having good cards in them and avoiding bad ones. So, to eventually recap everything that we've just gone over, I've created a short infographic here that you can screenshot and save and use as a quick reference. But to just quickly cover it, units can be broken down into 3 main types. Tempo units, who impact the board with things like blitz or deployments. Value units, who provide extra cards, such as spawning multiple units or drawing more cards. Snowballers are units that must be removed, or they can take over a match. Bombers, artillery, or things that grow out of control. When picking units, and if you are unsure of what to pick, focus on good tempo stuff. You can just take over the board and win before value matters. In an ideal world, though, you do want a bit of all 3 of them. Then, moving on, orders can be broken down into 3 main types: removal, card draw, and board buffers. Removal and card draw are very important, and when drafting, the first few of them should be an extremely high priority. However, as you get your first couple removal and card draw pieces, they become less important, and they are best chosen, units are better chosen over them after you have those first crucial few. Board buffs are fine if you have them, but otherwise aren't super important. When you are drafting, try to pay attention to your curve. Generally, you want to have the most at 4 credits with a decreasing amount towards the 1 and 7 credit amount. You still need to have a good amount of 1 and 7k units, but you should try to peak at the 3, 4, and 5 credit ranges. Pay attention when drafting as to how many cards are in a stack. It's okay to pick one bad card rather than four mediocre ones. Save your slots for the potential of finding better cards in future picks. And then remember, you only need 3 wins to break even. 50% win rate, and you have successfully turned a profit in draft. Now, let's go ahead and actually go through a full drafting in order to kind of show all of what I have just been talking about in action. We're just going to draft in this one, and then I will probably make a second video that will be linked down in the description whenever it gets done in order to kind of go through and see if we can get 7 wins with the deck. But let's go ahead and start by picking our nation. Now, these options are not exactly the best. Britain is, I would say, the worst nation in the game. The Soviets are probably one of the best major nations in current draft, while Japan is, I would say, a bit on the weaker end. For the sake of this example, I'm going to go with Japan. But if you were trying to just do wins, something like the Soviets or Germany or the US would be a better option. But let's go ahead with Japan and see what we can do. So starting out, we have 3 cards, 2 orders and a bomber. Now these 2 cards, Outmaneuver and One Roof, are both pretty synergy reliant cards. One Roof is at best 5 credits, draw 2 until I get a lot of credit loss, which is unlikely to happen unless if this was late in a draft and I had a lot of those already, maybe I would pick them. But as it stands, these are just 5 credit, draw 2, which is not good. Outmaneuver, on the other hand, is also highly synergistic. At best, I might get to operate a unit for free, but that's just fairly low impact. Instead, I'm going to go with the Achi. This is a hard to interact with bomber and is kind of in the line of a snowballing unit where I can play this down relatively safely and get a free attack off with it and potentially snowball a board off of it. Here we have an option. We have a potential removal piece, a card draw, and then a unit that is also serving as card draw. Now, Under Fire is a 3 damage to ping 3 units, which is fairly low removal, is fairly weak in terms of removal. The pin is not always going to be the most useful because we're looking to often kill stuff in drafts and not stall the game out. Whereas something like Take Liberty, it is potentially good card draw, especially if our deck is, quite aggressive. We can very easily equalize the game by stripping the enemy of cards. However, Shogi is a fairly solid unit. A 5/1, it's able to trade pretty well, being able to deal with an enemy unit most often. Covert makes it quite difficult to actually be attacked into. Like, they can't use a removal to kill it, and when it dies, it draws a card. Now, 3 is maybe not the most ideal thing in the world in this instance. Like, I would not say Shogi is a top-tier unit, but we can fill out our 3-drop slot with them, and we won't be too disappointed. Moving on, we have 3 different units. Or we have Koto Bushido, which I would never pick because it's too reliant on air units, and I only have 1 at the moment, and I might not get many more. We have the 28cm coastal gun, or we have the 75mm mountain gun. Now, I already have 4 3-drops, which is quite a bit already. And as such, the 28 coastal gun is maybe a bit less appealing, so I'm going to personally opt for the 75mm for a 2-drop that I can play out, although I think either one of these would be a decent pick. Then we get our ally. So we can go with France, Poland, or Germany. In this instance, I think I'm going to go with Germany. I've never been a fan of France, especially since they keep getting mill stuff. I find them just inconsistent, and Poland is kind of a feast or famine nation. Like, either they are really, really good and like kind of insane, or they end up with a lot of kind of do-nothing orders and they feel pretty bad. Germany's pretty consistent and can help drag a nation like Japan up a bit. Now, here is a good example of an interesting choice, because even though Spoils of War might be like an okay choice, or like Spoils of War might be a better choice than like the U375, Spoils of War as a stack of 2 is not really worth picking. I would not want to put really 2 of these in my deck. And the U375 is also not that appealing. I'm actually going to opt for dive bombing here, because even though it is a stack of 3 and that's not the most ideal thing, currently I don't have pretty much any removal in my deck, so having 1 damage pings that also allow me to freely trade into units is fairly useful, and I'm going to go with it. Now here is a pretty easy choice. Suraga Regiment is just a really bad unit. It's combo oriented and otherwise has no use. The Kumamoto Regiment, it might have been an okay 3-drop, but I already have so many 3-drops, but Empire of the Sun is an absolute god tier late game card for Japan. Being able to draw me potentially 4 to 5 cards on top of killing something, yes please. Here we have a variety of pretty average units. The Toyama Regiment might be okay, but I don't really need more 3-drops at the moment, and I don't want 3 of them. Instead, I'm going to go with the Type 97 Shinhoto, because it is a tempo unit. It has Blitz on it. I can use it to get into the back line and apply pressure or kill a crucial enemy unit, and it's overall fairly solid. Here, I have an interesting choice between either a removal piece or the Panzer IV F2. Now, normally I would value the removal very highly at the moment because I'm still lacking it. However, Japan is like specifically kind of lacking in big units. So I'm actually going to go with the Panzer IV F2 because this is a really good tempo unit. So that's what I'm going to go with. Here, currently I have 2 tanks, so 33rd Panzer Grenadier has a little bit of value in it. I could also just go with the Kate as a 4-credit 3-2 bomber. I believe I'm just going to go with the Kate, because even though this is just pretty much a bad bomber, maybe I can get some discard in the future and that'll boost it a bit. But the problem, the thing is, I don't want to take up my ally slots with like the Panzer Grenadier, and rapid engagement is too combo oriented. So instead, I'm just going to go with the Kate as a 4-drop to start with. Here is a very easy choice with Winter Regiment being such a godly card. It is both good tempo because of Blitz, it has value because it heals itself for free trades, on top of salvaging. The Panther G is not a bad card either. The Kermach are pretty bad, but Winter is just such a good card that I'm going to immediately grab that up. Here we have a pretty weak fighter, a bunch of 1-credit 1-3 tanks that pretty much have no other synergy, or a removal piece. I'm going to go with air superiority because I have a couple aircraft already. Here is going to be an Aunt Frida. 1 roof again, I don't have anything to synergize and I don't want it. 4 prosperity might not be bad per se, but Aunt Frida is probably the better overall card because it's multiple buffs I can do over multiple turns. Here we have an option for some potential more removal or another Shogi detachment. Now, Through the Breach is a fairly okay removal piece, but I already have 3 dive bombings and an air superiority. I actually really don't need any more like low damage removals. I prefer some mid-range ones, so I'm going to go with the Shogi as it's just another decent-ish 3-drop. Here I'm going to... I think I'm going to go with the Panzer IIIJ here, because I still already have a lot of 3-drops, and I'd rather beef up with a couple more 4-drops. The 3J is pretty decent with its Blitz on it and a modest body overall, albeit a bit expensive to operate. But the Chi-Ro's not good, and the Coastal Howitzer is a 3-drop itself, and I just don't think I really need like a 8 or 7 1/8 3-drop in the deck right now. Here are 3 cards that are pretty weak. The Regiment is not worthwhile, as talked about previously. Focus Attack is just kind of too expensive for it, and I don't really want to fill up my German ally slots with a pretty weak card. So I'm going to go with the Type 92 because at least it's a 1-drop. Here I'm going to go with the Kagoshima Regiment. This is just a fairly decent 3-drop overall. Encirclement might be okay, but some stuff like Shogi Detachment are a bit hard to copy with it, and I don't otherwise have a lot of units at the moment that could benefit from this. Air, Land, and Sea is just kind of risky to take, and I think just having a good unit is, in that instance, the best. Here, the Panzer 38 is a very easy value card. The Type 95 is just pretty weak as a unit, and Momentum is very high risk for potentially low rewards, so card draw on a unit is really good. Here is where I'm going to immediately snatch up a removal piece. These other two units are pretty underwhelming. Even though I could maybe use another 1-drop, the 1st Infantry is pretty underwhelming, and I would much rather have something that I can kill bigger units with. Here is an interesting choice, though. I can either go with another command failure or another Panzer 38. Looking at my deck, I actually have quite a bit of draw already. I have the Shogis, I have a Panzer 38, Empire of the Sun, Aunt Frida. This is a lot of value already baked into the deck. I'm going to opt for a second removal piece because I want to value that higher right now. Here I am a bit torn. Pummel is an okay removal piece as well, but now that I've picked up the command failures, I don't feel as pressured to snap up this removal, and instead I'm going to go with the Tojo because it can be fairly difficult to trade into. It can block bombers pretty well. It can maybe snipe a bomber out of the enemy hand. It overall just might get a decent little bit of use. Looking at our curve, we're getting pretty filled up on 3 and 4 cost units. So going forward, I may try to find something like another couple 1 and 2 drops or a couple more big units to round things out. In this instance, I'm going to go with another Cade as just kind of a bomber. Here, I'm going to go with the Zeke because it's a pretty good fighter that can maybe mess with countermeasures. Here, I'm going to instantly go for 24th. 81st is really slow and not that useful. Lightning Strike is a really bad countermeasure that does nothing on the board. 24th gives us a couple crucial 2-drops to make use of. Here's an interesting choice, though. So I would say that currently the Type 4 and the Takasaki are both pretty good units overall. Takasaki's a guard. It almost always goes 2 for 1. Type 4 Ho-Ro is a pretty decent artillery that the enemy might not be able to deal with. But I do have a lot of 4-drops at the moment, 8 of them. So do I really need additional 4-drops? I would almost rather have something to play on turn 2. So I'm going to go with the Kurumi Regiment. Even though I would say it's maybe the weakest of these options, I feel like I need to kind of fill my early game a bit more, because if I don't do anything on turn 1 or turn 2, I will be usually falling too far behind. Here, I'm going to go with the 113th Schutzen. Expansion is a okay removal or an okay draw card. However, as talked about previously, this deck is already pretty good on draw, and I'd rather have more options for removal, and Schutzen is essentially a removal tool. Here, The Type 89 is definitely not worth picking. The question is, do I want Pummel or do I want the 432nd? Now, I could probably use a couple more 1-drops, but the fact that I have a lot of pings means that I can kind of get away with not having a 1-drop because I can respond. And I do have a couple more 2-drops now, so my early game is a bit better off. I'd also prefer to try to hold out for better German cards. So I think I'm going to just go with the Pummel here as another removal piece. And I can even maybe suppress something, and let's see if we can't get something a little bit better for our German cards. Here, I think I'm going to go with the U375. This is kind of falling into the line of what I was talking about with picking maybe a worse option to not take too many cards. The Gebrigtsjäger is definitely the best of these 3 options, but I don't want to really have 2 of them in the deck. I'd rather try to dig for some better cards, so I'm going to take a slightly worse card in favor of it. Here, I'm going to go immediately for an F2 again. I am still very much lacking late game units, so anything big I can get is very appreciated. I think here's going to be a 4 prosperity. Defeat in detail is potentially really good, but I actually don't have a lot of early units to make use of it. So instead, 4 prosperity can help me in trading a bit more efficiently. Here I'm going to go with more 24th Cavalry, gives me more card draw, also keeps filling out my 2-drops. These other 2 cards are pretty worthless. Hopefully we can find 1 or 2 more big units, because right now we are pretty lacking. Here, I'm probably going to go with the Akita because it's a decent enough 2-drop, and to finish it out, I'm going to go probably with Bonsai here. Board clears are fairly hard to come by, and the other 2 options are pretty bad and don't really do a whole lot to the board, so having at least a big board clear might help. So with this draft, I pretty much got a fairly healthy early game and mid game. However, my late game is notably quite lacking. And as such, I'm going to need to make sure I leverage a strong early game to overwhelm the enemy before things drag on too long. But that will be the end of this first part of this tutorial. In the next part, we'll go in and we'll play this to see how many victories we get. If we can't get at least 6 wins with it to make our money back, or at least getting 3 wins to break even. If you found this useful, make sure to like and subscribe. And otherwise, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of this video, and I hope you have a good day.